Please make gesho. The sacred presence of the one who said he would abide in his teachings be our guide. May we follow his glorious example and tread with unfaltering steps this noble path until we too shall attain enlightenment. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, maha, prajna, paramita. Good evening, and once again, welcome to those of you joining us. It's good to see you, Connie. Tonight, I want to talk about something that I'm titling this talk as great grief. And there's a little bit of tenderness in me as I start speaking of it. When I talk about great grief, it's an embodied feeling. And recently I encountered this embodied feeling as I was driving home from work, from the hospital. And I had seen a variety of people throughout the day and encountered several stories that I found very both poignant and tragic. And different people had different stories. So it wasn't as if it was just one thing. But I had had a pretty challenging day, and I got in the car and I drove around in circles in the parking garage to get out of the parking garage into the sunlight, get up to a first stoplight to be able to turn from the hospital property out onto the city streets. And I watched a gentleman, an older gentleman in one of those motorized scooters, was crossing the street in front of me. And he had on a camo vest and some little American flags on the back of his scooter, which to my mind says veteran of some sort. And yet, as he was driving his scooter across the sidewalk in front of my car, he was just sort of leaned over and he just had this very sad look on his face. So, encountering several different flavors of tragic stories in the hospital, leaving my workplace, encountering this gentleman as he drove his scooter in front of my car. And I clocked that I watched him the whole way. I wanted to make sure that he made it through the crosswalk safely. But I was just hit with a huge wave of sorrow, just a huge wave of grief and it wasn't any one particular story, but just at this sense of human suffering. This, oftentimes I'll talk in terms of the 6 realms, but it's not just the particular hell realm that I was keying into, but just the sorrow that comes with birth and death, living an embodied life, meeting conditions, and having that feeling of suffering or that grief just be so overwhelming. And it had nothing to do with my particular body or mental state, other than I had just witnessed all of these things. I wasn't personally being threatened. And it seems like I had gone from encountering different versions of personal grief and instead sank into this very wide, vast sense of just grief, just humanity-wide, universe-wide suffering. It was sort of that was underneath all of that grief. And so in our stories, in our Buddhist stories, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what our practice is and what our history is, we have this story of 11-headed Kannon, or 11-headed Kanzeon. Oftentimes you can see this figure of what we would often call Kannon or Kanzeon but in Tibetan traditions might be called Chinrizig, or in the Sanskrit with the Sanskrit names Avalokiteshvara. But there's often this figure of compassion, and there are depictions of this figure of compassion with 11 heads with a tiny little head on top. And there are several different versions of the story of this 11-headed Kannon. And there's one story that said that Kannon or Kanzeon had made a vow to save all beings from the hell realms and had emptied the hell and turned around to look behind her and saw hell repopulated with numberless beings again. And she was so struck, her head split open. And she did this 10 times. 10 times. That's a vow. She did this 10 times. And finally, Amida or Amitabha put his head on top. So he's sort of her spiritual father. He put all of her heads back together. He put his head on top. There's another version of the story that says when Kanzeon looked back to see the hell realms repopulated, that when she looked back and saw all the beings in hell again, her head split into 10 different pieces. And Amida once again gathered the pieces and put his head on top. And when Kyogen told me this story, when I was very early in my practice, and I must have been, I don't know what I had brought to him, some version of my discontent. He told me this story of 11-headed Kanzeon. All he said was, and she looked back and saw the hell realms repopulated, and her head exploded. That was the word her head exploded. Amida very carefully brought all the pieces back together and put his head on top. So we have this story of, at the time I interpreted that story as sort of overwhelming frustration, but I also think it speaks to overwhelming grief and witnessing overwhelming grief. The overwhelm both being in numbers, but also in repetition. I see this repetition aspect in work in the hospital. One patient gets discharged and the next thing you know, the room is being filled again with another patient who's needing care, and both physical care and spiritual care. So when I talk about great grief, when I'm using this term great grief, I'm speaking of it in terms of grief around systems or grief that is bigger than ourselves. It's bigger than our own single story. And not as a way to diminish grief that is personal or grief that is unique to our story, because we all encounter that from time to time. But this is I'm talking about something a little different in that the vastness of it. So I think all of us, I'm assuming all of us, have encountered these instances of experiencing this, what I'm calling this great grief. And for some, it might be a touch of dismay and grief and loss over stories around climate change, around the way the world is changing. It might be about wildfires or ecosystem loss. It could be around these encounters we've had with the pandemic, whether it's loss of life or health or loss of capacity to engage in the world and society in the way that we used to. This great grief may come up for those who are working in the carceral system and working with people who have been imprisoned for a long time, which causes a particular kind of suffering. And this also comes about with seeing patterns system-wide patterns that are not in accord with our wishes or the way we think things should be. For those who are engaging in the Awakening to Whiteness program, perhaps there's a great grief that arises when working with the subject matter of centuries of oppression. It's hard material to take in, and yet it's it's important that we don't block ourselves off from this great grief when it arises. Mm. Oftentimes, mm, oftentimes there's a wish to jump past it and get back to a sense of wholeness. I know I certainly felt that at that stoplight the other day of like, here's this overwhelming grief, and how do I, like, what do I do with this? Do I push it down? Do I push it away? Do I let it be? Do I pull my car over and just cry? But I wonder about this idea of wholeness. What is, what is wholeness? Sometimes wholeness is just an idea that I was a particular way in a previous moment, and I would rather go back to that than meet what is in front of me right now. Sometimes wholeness is a felt sense, such that the body feels out of balance and wants to return to a sense of balance. And I think there's something cultural in our society, in our culture that um, tells us or gives us the messaging that if we are experiencing grief or if we are experiencing pain, the best thing to do is get rid of it. And one of the beautiful things about Buddhism is that it gives space for that. And it asks, what is pain? What is grief? And we're asked to lean into it. Where is it coming from? Perhaps. How does it feel in the body? What is grief when it arises? How does it feel when it dissipates? Hmm. There's not always a need to push it away. It is possible to sit with it and to know it and to know it and to know it and to know it and to trust that it will leave when it's time to leave. Sometimes our grief is appropriate to the situation. I think um, facing great grief and not feeling pain um, might be more troubling to me than feeling the pain of it. And impermanence is our friend. Grief, whether it's great grief or personal grief, will arise and fall in its own time. That we don't have to fix it or um, try to change it in any particular way to make it more palatable. And you know, with all of this, I want to give the caveat that um, that phrase I said a minute ago about sometimes grief is appropriate to the situation. It's important for each of us to know our own body and our own mind, in that sometimes we can get stuck in grief, or sometimes it can hang on in a way that is no longer appropriate to the situation. And in that case, perhaps it is time to speak with someone or um, work with a mental health professional to help bring that back into some sense of balance. It's easy sometimes to get caught in definitions of, well, how much is enough or how much is sticky or um, but I think knowing your own self is important. Going back to that story of 11-headed Kanan, 11-headed Kanzan, I want to point out that aspect of Amida putting his head on top of hers when he reassembled her heads. And this is an image that has that I've been working with throughout my year in the hospital. In that I wrote about this story in one of my early reflection papers, and I just wrote about how sometimes even compassion needs help. Sometimes even the bodhisattva of compassion needs someone to be with her in her grief or frustration or despair, that we can't do this by ourselves. We are individuals, but we are not necessarily solitary beings. And in great grief, in this heart-wrenching grief, in this tender feelinged grief, we have tools that can be helpful in our Zen practice, in our rituals, in our forms. Oftentimes, dedicating merit can help meet that grief, that vastness of just whatever I do that is skillful and of benefit, may it be dedicated to all those who suffer. May it be dedicated to all those in pain, all those who are alone. Dedicating merit keeps the heart open, even when sometimes it wants to close or hide away. It keeps us connected to those around us. Along those lines, we can make offerings, whether it's of merit or of our time and our energy. Perhaps grief, this great grief, inspires us towards action, towards helping. Zazen itself is a practice of transformative change. It creates a container in which grief can arise and abide and fall away. And we can just notice it and sit with it. And there's a very different feeling of companioning your grief than trying to put it in a box or push it away. And we have the practice of vow. And we don't often talk about the Bodhisattva vow in this lineage. Oftentimes, we really even articulate it as a group. Pretty much at lay disciple ceremonies and New Year's Eve ceremonies. Kyogen used to say that it's a considerable vow, and people shouldn't be articulating that when they're just very brand new to practice. But the way we recite the Bodhisattva vows, beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unattainable, I vow to realize it. And it's with such a vast vow that we can meet vast grief, great grief. All through this year at the hospital, I've joked to myself that someday the chaplains we take turns saying the morning prayer in the hospital. Someday I'm going to get up there and say something from the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines or the Heart Sutra, or just bust out something Buddhist in this Catholic hospital. And this morning, one of the other Buddhist chaplains read um, a portion of Shantideva's Way of the Bodhisattva as a prayer this morning. And it was vast and it was Buddhist, and I loved it. That's a little bit of an aside, like where I'm going with this talk, um, but I did notice the vastness of it, of Shantideva's way of articulating his vow of practice. That it is grand, that it is beyond human, that it is an antidote to witnessing the sufferings of the world. And that language, that phrase is used a lot in Buddhism, even in the name of Kanzan, she who hears the cries of the world. We talk a lot about witnessing the suffering of the world, but we speak of it, when we speak of it, it's like, here's me, and here's the suffering of the world. And then as we get into practice, we realize I'm not separate from the suffering of the world. But there's not a lot of time when we talk about what comes up within us in response to the suffering of the world. And the strength that it takes to see that suffering and to hold it. So we have this teaching of 11-headed Kanzeon, the story of 11-headed Kanzeon, which I love because sometimes I feel like my head's going to explode. Or perhaps I want to give up, even though I know I can't. But there's that impulse of, oh, this is too much. And I think that's part of what makes this grief great, is that sense of it's too much, I can't hold anymore. It's too big. And I hear that again and again in people talking about the state of the world, or the environment, or education, or racism. It's too big. How do I do this? I think we can do this. We do this by doing our practice. We do this by coming together in community, offering support to each other, even as we do our own practice. We don't do this alone. Maybe your kind word to a Sangha member might be that little aspect of a little touch of Amita's head on top of Kanzeon's reassembled pieces. Part of my year I've spent studying grief theory as a chaplain. And, you know, in there's several different approaches to grief theory, but one lists a certain number of tasks to be done as someone approaches grief. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but two of them caught my eye. The first one is just accepting the reality of that which is lost. And in a way, Buddhism does this really well. Like, a lot of our language is around accepting and meeting and witnessing and naming and being with and being present with. We do that pretty good. But another of these aspects of grief theory comes with dealing with the emotional pain of encountering this loss. And I think we sometimes do this okay. I think as human beings, we want to jump over it or to jump past it. And in Zen, we have a habit of talking about emphasizing equanimity and tranquility and this sense of quietude. I think in Zen, we can also have expressions of pain or of anguish or of it's too much, and being tearful and tenderhearted. But we tend to keep those quiet. We keep those to ourselves. We don't talk about them much. I think we can talk about them. I think we can talk about them with each other. And I think we can talk about them as Sangha too. Because our emotional selves are part of who we are. We don't want to wall them away. but to embrace them and work with them skillfully. So I think what I want to leave you with are perhaps some questions to ponder. One is have you experienced great grief, and what I'm calling great grief? And what might have been the I don't want to say the inspiration for that or the source of that. But in light of great grief, how do we continue? How do we sustain ourselves? And what does your practice look like in times of great grief? So with that, I'll open it up for discussion or questions or comments, however you feel moved to interact.
I can talk first, but yes, I can very much relate to this, especially the story about, well, the story about Kanzian's head exploding really just kind of spoke to me because I kind of feel like that right now. I really am feeling it. I'm feeling that a huge sense of grief and just not kind of knowing really what to do. Like I just kind of at my wit's end with COVID and even climate change. I mean, there's just so much. And I guess for me, like what I'm doing to get through it is number one, just kind of, I try not to, I have massive anxiety. So I guess for me right now is I'm trying to manage my anxiety, I guess, take care of myself, so I can help others. I mean, I have a job where I work with the public and my job is to help others. And so I have to try to, be a good helper without, I don't know, like being a jerk, I guess. I don't know. Try to be the best helper that I can. So
Do you give yourself time to be Monica, the not being a helper right now?
Oh yeah, I do actually. Yes, I do. I have to, or else and I think that's one thing that I've learned, especially during this time of COVID, is that I really have to give myself those times. I have to make a point of taking care of myself. And at work, I really have to make a point of having quiet time for myself because I know that that's really important for me. I have to go somewhere by myself and eat lunch or just have a break by myself. It's real because I know that that is something that I need in order to be able to help people and be a good, be a kind person to them and be helpful. And I know everybody is feeling the same way. Everybody that comes into the library is feeling the same thing. So try to just kind of have compassion for that and realize that not to take it personally, if somebody gets angry and just, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
My grief bubbles into anger.
Say more.
Oh, name one: climate, stupidity of investment in oil, use of armed forces, armed force to try to control other people. Oh, sure. And I'm also enrolled in the white studies class. racism.
Mhm.
It's not so much anger as sadness that outcome of human behavior.
Do you ever just let it be grief? Or is it ever just grief? You said it quickly goes into anger.
No, it doesn't go away. Did I say that?
Mm.
No, it's there. It's just
Mhm.
there. And I suppose that's really grief.
Yeah.
And
Anger wants things to be different.
beg your pardon?
But anger wants things to be different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet anger is one of the stages of grief, theoretically.
Mhm. There's definitely connections there. Yeah. So what do you do with your anger, Shokai?
Um,
Or how do you
get a
respond?
warm belly, and I walk it. I walk, and it doesn't show up in sitting in my thinking, but it shows up as walking in the outdoors,
Mhm.
um, and then accepting that I'm not doing anything. I mean, no, that's not true. I write letters, I join things, I support good causes that ameliorate the harm in small ways. So yeah, I act out of compassion towards, and I try not to do any of the harmful things that I blame others for, or throw
Mhm.
mud at others for.
Mhm.
Yeah, I do that.
Mhm. You have a caring heart. At least that's my reflection is you have a caring heart.
Hmm.
I think for me, sometimes is just accepting what is mine to do in with all the grief that surrounds us every day. And it's hard sometimes because I think many of us are fixers at heart. We want to take care of it and fix it. And sometimes even like with this COVID stuff, it just is, I think I had 6 families today. 2 of the families that I called, their whole family has COVID. And in those discussions, asking them, did like simple things like, did you get tested? Well, one person got tested in the whole family. Nobody else went and got tested because we all know that we all have it. And their frustration and their grief around what's happening and just not being able, one family actually took her kid into the doctors. And this was kind of a real sadness for me today. One had a child, I think she might be like 6. Everybody else stayed home, but she was worried about her 6-year-old. So she took her 6-year-old to the urgent care. Urgent care turned her away, wouldn't even let her in the door, said, you're supposed to call us before you come. And she said, I need you to listen to my kid's lungs. And they said, no, we'll do a virtual visit for you. You go home and call us. And so out of her frustration, she called her doctor and said, I need to bring her in. The doctor said, no, you're not bringing her in. We'll do a virtual visit today and I'll subscribe something for her cough.
Mm.
And hearing these families really just sadness and grief for just this loss of even a health system that they are so used to being able to depend on, and nothing is the same anymore. Nothing, they just can't grab onto anything right now, that it's really hard for them to find the positive in. So I have to, at the end of the day, many times just tell myself, this is not yours to fix. You can't fix, everything is just way too big. You can do little pieces here, but otherwise your head would explode like that. And sometimes when I do feel like it's going to explode, even tonight, listening to you, it's a good reminder that even Kanzian felt like her, her head was going to explode, and she still managed to keep going for all beings. And so I think it was really good to hear that tonight, that, even Kanzian felt like this and kept going. So I thank you for the Dharma talk tonight.
And thank you for the work that you do too. And you, Shokai, and you, Moni. I think each person in this, I was going to say each person in this room, each person in this Zoom space brings forth their life energy in a particular way. And that is an offering that ripples out, that touches other lives. Human lives, animal lives, lives of strangers, lives of people that we know.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you for the talk. It really, it's, and then when Shokai talked about the stages, or somebody mentioned the stages of grief, and I think I run around in denial a lot of times, and then something slaps me in the face.
Mm-hmm.
But there is so much stuff going on now. It is overwhelming, and and trying to do something about it is overwhelming, because we can't do huge things, we can do small things.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've mentioned it a lot in different contexts, because people say, how are you doing? And I say, well, I'm doing fine, but all the stuff, so much is happening around me and to people I love. And, and there's nothing I can do. I mean, I can listen. I think that's the main thing I've done with some of the people who are going through their own personal grief. But then there's, all the stuff that we've all talked about, the environment, the wars, the COVID, and COVID coming, having to wear masks again and people not doing it. And there, I was in the grocery store today, and an awful lot of people were not wearing masks. And 4 firemen, when they're full gear, walked in to go shopping, and none of them put a mask on. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, if I passed them, but then they went off to a different direction than I did. But I was going to say, well, then firemen, I guess, don't have to wear masks. And, but, because when you have someone dressed in a uniform, they are an example. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like, well, we're firemen, we don't need to wear masks. And so, and I don't know if people are aware of the mask mandate, or whether it actually officially started. I heard it was happening, but and I do a lot of what Shokai does, is walk by the river, walk in the woods, sleep on the ground, stuff like that. Because I you know, and I do service work. You know, I don't have a job now where I'm helping people, but I do volunteer stuff to help. But it sometimes seems so minuscule. And I also get tired of all the requests for money for the environment, for the political parties, for you know, it's like I give donations to one thing and I get 10 solicitations from organizations of that type. You know, well, or I give to one thing and then they say, thank you for your donation. Now can you donate an extra blah, blah, blah. You know, it's kind of like, but it all is, you know, I hadn't thought of it as being grief, but a lot of it is the grief of the stuff that's going on.
Mhm.
So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And Penny, I just want to float the idea that you are enough as you are. It's not about how much you do, but you being you is enough. We're at 8:12, and Teiko, you had unmuted yourself a minute ago. Would you like to have the last comment or question?
I was thinking about the that very often, especially in the fall, when the leaves are turning and the air has that sharp quality, I am often overcome with a sense of grief over the passage of time.
Mm,
And it's such a piercing, sharp feeling. It's unutterably poignant and not even uncomfortable, just immense. Yeah. So thank you for articulating that idea of great grief, because that kind of felt like that.
Thank you for introducing time, like just the passage of time itself as a source of grief.
Yeah. And as you said, impermanence is our friend, but it carries tremendous grief.
Yeah. That's true. The universe is as the boundless sky. Just as the lotus is not wetted by the water that surrounds it, the mind is immaculate and beyond the dust. Let us bow to the highest Lord. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, maha prajna paramita. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a pleasant evening. Feel free to unmute and say good night and